The Roadrunner and Coyote could best be described as not how to catch a roadrunner, but how not to catch a roadrunner. Comedy is as much what you don't do as what you do. You must narrow yourself, as in any other form. We all set our disciplines. Mondrian said his
probably the greatest animator and one of the greatest storytellers of all time.
The 9 rules of the Roadrunner.
What he was trying
just
to do
establishing a fact that there are certain rules that you just have to adhere to.
Rule number 1, the Roadrunner cannot harm the coyote except by going beep beep.
Rule number 2, no outside force can harm the coyote. Only his own ineptitude for the failure of the ACME products.
Rule number 3, the coyote could stop any time if it were not a fanatic.
Rule number 4, no dialogue ever except beep beep.
Rule number 5, the Roadrunner must stay on the road, otherwise logically he would not be called Roadrunner.
Rule number 6, all action must be confined to the natural environment of the 2 characters, the Southwest American desert.
Rule number 7, all materials, tools, weapons, or mechanical conveniences must be obtained from the ACME Corporation.
Rule number 8, whenever possible, make gravity the coyote's greatest enemy.
Rule number 9, the coyote is always more humiliated than harmed by his failures.
Okay, beaming to you from ACME Broadcast Headquarters in Venice Beach, California. The ACME Writing Academy is on the air. This is Rick Krizman, along with today's panel of rule makers and rule breakers, Mike Magnuson, Bob Clark, Jim Frank, and Marcello Vazquez, welcoming you to tonight's investigation of Chuck Jones and his 9 rules of the Roadrunner. So, Mike, what's up with this?
This is Chuck Jones, probably the greatest animator and one of the greatest storytellers of all times. And what he was trying to do was put something together that was consistent. Shall we say consistent? Is that a word we can use?
Absolutely.
What do you think, Marcello?
Consistency annoys me. No, consistency has to do with production. I think regularity is a better word.
Oh man! See, like I live in near Green Bay, Wisconsin, and the coach Mike McCarthy the Green Bay Packers always talks about, I really like regularity in our practices. You know, what does that mean? The whole team goes out there and takes
It's all about bowel movement. Exactly.
I know. It's all like we're talking about art here. Do we want to have regularity in our art?
That's when I hear the word consistency, it inspires me to say the word regularity.
You know, the 9 rules of the Roadrunner is just establishing a fact that there are certain rules that you just have to adhere to. And not only in the Roadrunner series, but in what we're talking about writing. There are certain things that you just can't fucking do. And I think that's that's being illustrated by these nine rules of the Roadrunner.
Well, I think you got 2 things at work here. First of all, these rules, they don't apply to TV writing in general. They just apply to this particular show. It's what makes it this show as opposed to another show. And
it goes back to what Mike was saying, the continuity. Because
Right,
when you tune in, when you watch a Roadrunner cartoon, you know what to expect.
Exactly.
You know Bugs Bunny isn't going to show up.
Well, I think you expect certain things in a story, and usually in good writing, the main character is usually his own worst enemy. I mean, the stock characters around him may affect him, but the person who really hurts himself or herself is the main character, in this case, the coyote.
That's great. That pertains to rule number 3, that the coyote could stop at any time if he were not a fanatic.
I was thinking about rule number 1. I mean, the Roadrunner is a stock character. It's not really the coyote is his own worst enemy. But there's the really cool toys he gets from ACME, I have to say, right? The detonation box, the TNT, the vehicles he uses to try and run the Roadrunner down. Cannons.
The rocket shoes are some of my favorites.
Right, and the spring-loaded cantaloupe, not cantaloupe.
The spring-loaded cantaloupe.
Actually, catapult.
The interesting thing is most of the ACME products work better than, one would expect.
They work better than they should. That's the problem.
Yeah.
No, the problem is the coyote has to work them.
Right. But I mean, like the glue, right? When he's, tries to, get his hand off the boomerang, and he gets attached to it because he gets glued to it.
Right.
Yes.
And the glue's too good. Now, I'd like to say that ACME products tend to be excellent.
Well, we know that.
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to do here without being obvious.
This is product placement. So, you know what? One thing that makes me, just to get it back on a literary level, is it makes me think about the old trope about making the contract with the reader. That if you're writing a story, right at the beginning, you say, okay, these are the rules of the game. This is going to be a genre piece, or it's going to be literary, or whatever. You lay it right out so there's an implicit set of rules for a story, and you have to adhere to those rules, or the reader goes, what the hell? Where did that gun come from? There's no guns in this story, right?
Maybe what we're really talking about is constraints. When we write a story, only certain things can happen, and then that sets a not a boilerplate, but like something's going to happen within a room, and we can't leave that room, which is a lot like our lives. You know, we are trapped within ourselves, as it were, and all we can know as far as a narrative is what happens to us.
Along those lines, I mean, what you're talking about here with all these rules are, you know, what they talk about way back in the day called the 3 unities: time, action, and character.
Mm-hmm. The verities.
Or the verities, and you know, in other works. I mean, in French, I think it's the unities, but nevertheless, it's the same concepts, and that's what goes on with the Roadrunner and Coyote. Is it takes place within a very short frame of time. There's one particular place, the Great American Southwest. It falls, you know, within those really narrow formal rules that one used to think should be done in all theater. I mean, Racine, the great French playwright, followed all of those unities.
So we're saying that when there's a constriction like this really is natural to the human expression, or is this natural to artifice?
Well, human expression. So we're all limited beings. We all have our own rules of what makes us who we are.
What we're talking about, a lot of what we do is because we're in one way or the other trained to produce an effect. So I don't know if it's a metaphysical or more of that we are already in one way or the other, conscious or unconsciously, creating a certain form to be read.
Do you guys get frustrated with some stories that don't bother with any of these sorts of constraints?
Well, there's the rub, Jim. Are there any stories? Is there any work of art that doesn't function within a set of constraints? Even if the piece of art were to function without constraints, that would be the constraint within which it functioned.
Are you talking about The Third Policeman by Flann O'Brien?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I am, you know.
Old Man Mathers, we know from the outset, who's being the narrator is the Selby, an amateur crackpot philosopher, has already started the main character is dead. And he is in a 2-dimensional hell. Of course, apparently it's satire. But we know that in the first 40 words, what to expect. So you could put the book down and read no further than that. But it's up front. There are no surprises midway to the novel. It's set up within the 2 to 3 pages that you read that book.
See, I don't think we're surprised really with anything we come across, you know, even if it's experimental literature or art or music or drama or something. Within a very short period of time, the form of the thing makes itself available, so we understand what we're going to get. I think of when Beckett's play Waiting for Godot first appeared after World War II. You know, this was not done where 2 people just stood on the stage,
right,
and nothing happened except for 2 people come along and talk gibberish, which is essentially what happens in that play.
Right.
But you can't miss getting the drill from very early on. So it's experimental, it's crazy, it's avant-garde, you can say what you want, but it's following its own set of rules, is it not?
Yeah. Historical set of rules. Beckett brings his work in right after World War II, right? Mm-hmm. Every institution, everything that, literature or everyone believed in had been one way or the other bombed or destroyed or transformed.
Sure. But, someone like Beckett, he's also, I mean, he's been trained according to certain preoccupations he had about those sorts of 3 unities by all sorts of writers and dramatists in the first 25 years of the 20th century. he's reading the plays, by Jean-Henri Giraudoux, Paul Claudel, or Jean Cocteau, where time, place. Wow. You say Jean Cocteau and there's thunder.
Nice.
Jean Cocteau.
Was that the beast by any chance? Or is that the blood of the poet? But anyway, I think
blood usually.
When you think about a play or, even a short film that Cocteau made, like The Blood of the Poet, Beckett looks at something like that and thinks, okay, well, we're just going to fracture that idea that there's even any sort of sense of a plot even further and make things even really bizarre. But I think, when I look at some of these rules here, it seems to me that the one thing that we're going to talk about at some point is we're going to talk about voice. And that's the one thing that sort of is left out of all these rules. Did you guys notice that how it's articulated by the author doesn't really fit in here, does it?
Well, voice is something specific as opposed to something generic. So voice is going to be defined by some limitations.
And, well, I guess my question or thought is that voice, then we take these sorts of standard ways of arranging narratives, and it's voice that gives each one its own distinct character and its own distinct plot and its own distinct feel.
I think a writer's style is what produces voice, right? Is it a chicken and the egg thing? Where does voice produce style? I think it's the style that you write in is what produces your voice.
I agree, and I think also to take that one step further is that style is a function of your limitations.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting way to look at it,
right?
Because usually we think of it the other way around. The style is, you're magnificent. You can do anything you want,
Right.
But in fact, as people, we can't really. And if you think of it in a practical way, you think of the Chuck Jones coming up with these rules for the Roadrunner. They knew what they could do in the animation studio. They knew what the art would look like because it always sort of looked within parameters sort of similar, like Chuck Jones did Christmas guy that everybody likes. The Grinch, right?
Grinch,
Chuck
right.
Jones did the Grinch.
He did.
You know what I mean? And if you look at the Grinch, it's kind of quite visually like the Roadrunner, except it's on a mountaintop and there's a dog with antlers tied to its head.
But notice it takes place in the same spot over a certain number of hours in one night, and there's one main action, which is stealing all the toys, but then giving them back. So it follows the Roadrunner's rules perfectly.
Well, you talk about style and limitations. What was it? A. Houseman, who said that style is the man himself, which I take to mean that style is the thing about yourself that you can't disguise, that comes out regardless, which is the thing that's you, that it's not anybody else. You have your own world, a character. You as a person or a character, a fictional character, they have a world view. They accept this, they reject that. They have, if not explicit, then implicit rules to their own behavior, their own understanding of the universe. And that's what I think enables you to draw an effective character, is to give him those limitations, or her those limitations, and see how they function within that.
So we're not really talking about like rules like you have to put a comma before a coordinating conjunction that precedes an independent clause or anything like that. We're talking about
Can we come back to
that we can control the world that we're trying to put on the page.
Right. You build a world, and that world has rules, and you, the writer, establish the rules. And everything has to function within that. Otherwise, the reader goes,
and then
what the fuck, But you're right. I mean, there is a whole other set of rules, more objective, like which is a whole different thing, which is the rules of grammar, the rules of syntax, the rules of expressing yourself with clarity in the English language, right?
To say that is that everybody who studies creative writing, the first thing they want to hear is that you can break the rules. The rules are meant to be broken. Who doesn't want to hear that? Oh, it's everybody, man. Marvin Bell, the great Marvin Bell, the poet.
Of course.
His centerpiece of teaching, and he's right, is that, there are all these rules, but you're supposed to break them. That's what art is made of.
Yeah,
but I think that everybody wants to hear that, and then they maybe can get away with not learning lots of things in writing.
Well, see, I think that's the difference. People want to excuse bad writing as consciously breaking rules.
That's not
too well. If my story is so fabulous and interesting, isn't that like the responsibility of the editor?
Oh God, I've heard that a million times.
Yeah, I'm being sarcastic.
Yeah, right.
I remember I did a workshop once. I was in a workshop, and I don't know, this student or person was up for discussion and informed the room that, quote, "This will not reveal the gender. I'm just going to hire a developmental editor." People think that there's some kind of a conspiracy to keep us from being creative.
I think so.
What are you thinking? I know that Jim's stewing over there. I can tell he's in an existential funk.
No, not at all. And I'm listening and taking some notes. I think one of the things that I was considering is, in our narrative forms, we don't have anything like, for instance, a sonnet or a villanelle, or even something like you would call blank verse, that creates a set of limitations that you have to work within, both rhetorically, discursively. And I mean, if you're doing a narrative in poetry, it's going to affect how you present the narrative as well. In prose narratives, there's a lot to be said for the idea that, particularly in a short story, you're going to work in a very sort of confined set of parameters, and that's going to affect, the types of characters you choose. That's going to affect the action. You're not going to want the action cluttered with, side stories and things like that. So,
my experience with my my students, community college students, creative writing, and they would come in all gung-ho about breaking the rules, but they were mostly genre. They wanted to write sci-fi, or as the Roadrunner rules, right? The more you're looking at the right popular fiction, I think more restrictions you have.
I think so too. I also think that sometimes they want to break rules because they didn't write very well, and they want to call that, breaking the rule.
Absolutely.
Right.
You can't break rules if you don't know what the rules are.
Right, but the bad news I always give them is like, well, you want to break rules? Yeah, but the genre that you really want to write about has more rules you can ever imagine. So you better learn.
Yeah.
You better learn them.
That's a really good point.
That's true.
I think the reader, the more the genre or the type of writing that they're reading, crime fiction, sci-fi, there's a set of expectations that they're already expecting. And those become these, I guess, limiting rules to a certain extent, right?
Right.
Yep.
I'm bummed by
So
the
what
rules.
about experimentation then? I'm getting hung up on poetry thinking about all this. When I learned the rules, as it were, of poetry from Richard Kirkwood, Dick Kirkwood, and University of Wisconsin Eau Claire, and this was a man who, yes, he taught English composition, and then every class he taught with frogs that he drew on the classroom wall. So he would draw this weird frog with two eyes sticking out the top. It was like a circle with two kind of badly drawn eyes on the top. He would make tape recordings on a cassette recorder of Ribute, the frog, coming into his office and asking about his paper. So the frog would come in and say, like, "Oh, Mr. Kirkwood, I'm working really hard on my 5-paragraph essay. Can you give me some advice?" And then Mr. Kirkwood would talk to you. So then he would come in and play this tape for the class. Dude was a serious whack job, but also a genius. For freshman composition, we read Shakespeare, we read The Tempest, we read Chaucer. It was an amazing thing, and he believed in the purity of the forms of poetry. He taught us, sonnets and villanelles and cursuchutas and ways to understand syllabics and rhyme and rhythm and all this stuff. And when you think about poetry as something that's constructed, you're writing a form, a sonnet, whatever you say about it or not, it's controlled. There's only so many syllables that you can use in a line, and you have to rhyme. Even if you're going to cheat on the rhyme, you have to find a way to make it work as a slant rhyme, an I rhyme, something like that. You have to make something conform to the form, even if you're trying to go outside of it at the same time. And to me, I like those restrictions. I like that idea. You know, I've thought a lot about poetry that you shouldn't, for instance, put a conjunction on the end of a line. You shouldn't break a line with an and or with a preposition or what have you.
Yeah.
Now, what happens if yet you don't want to put yet on the end of a line?
Yet.
According to what I learned from Richard Kirkwood, God rest his soul, who was, to me, the most important teacher I ever had, who quantified these things for me.
And yet.
Line break. What happens when you let all that go? Are you still writing a poem that conforms to something, or are you just whipping your pudding?
No.
And this was the question he always asked. That was Dick Kirkwood didn't use those words, whipping your pudding. No. I think it was something, making your blancmange or whatever. But.
He did use
serious man.
He did use French words from time to time.
I know. He had a vocabulary. He was famous for only using like 700 words in his whole life. That's what he said.
Pouvez-vous
yeah, pouvez-vous the fuzzy pussy.
Yeah, that's our soundbite for the top of the show.
So, yeah. Mike, I mean, it's like, I don't know. I mean, I guess in today's context, right, if you speak of the form of sonnets and villanelles and sestinas, et cetera, right, it's all restricts a writer's creativity. What's the historical context on that? I don't think they came at it because they were trying to restrict the form. I think they were trying to be more right in the form in which one can remember the song.
Interesting.
Poetry.
By giving it a kind of an iambic lilt or something, people are likely to be able to recite it, remember it, and recite it in an oral tradition.
That's why Shakespeare used the form. If you read any Shakespeare, it's iambic pentameter, but it falls into dactyls and it's spondies. But the regular rhythm is always going to be iambic.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not consistently iambic because he would be an amateur if he did that. One of the things I always thought interesting is that fiction, or when you're writing something creatively, you're arguing a reality to your audience, if that makes any sense. It's almost like an argument that you're trying to convince them by the techniques that you're using that the world that you're creating exists.
Exactly, and that the Coyote can order things from Acme Company.
That's right.
Exactly.
Do we doubt that? No, we don't.
Never.
It's a logical absurdity that a truck shows up with a box for Wile E. Coyote.
But do we ever think about that? No,
because he would exactly
shows up. It's the rule.
And it was Jeff Bezos who was sending him that shit.
I think that all this stuff that we're talking about form is right on the money. I mean, this is like we understand when we're learning how to write. Maybe we don't think about those things. That really what we need to do is we're trying to learn a bunch of parameters that we know how we're doing it, instead of winging it on inspiration alone. We're telling ourselves a lie if we're thinking we can only go on inspiration. We're not going to use limitations.
Right. Inspiration is just as dependable.
Yeah, I mean, inspiration is great, but inspiration works within parameters.
Exactly.
You think though, for our generation, truly, those Warner Brothers cartoons, that was really it.
No, that was everything. For my formative years,
I'll tell you, it's still funny too.
This is a total side note, but have you ever seen the last episode of Flipper?
Yeah.
Do they kill him?
It was grim. Yeah.
No.
Does he die? Spoiler alert.
With a torpedo. It's the best.
I'm starting to run out of wine, so we're going to have to wrap it up.
Let's do it.
What do you got? Anybody?
My opinion, you have to know your shit. It takes a long time. When I was a chef or working as a cook all my life, the more experience you have, the more you learn, trial and error, whatever it is, criticism, plates coming back and they say this veal parmesan sucked, was burned, whatever it is. You got to get yourself in the mix. I don't know how you could really prepare someone. I remember I was in culinary school and they were like, well, here are the rules to make, a ragu. And you go out, you follow the rules, and everyone sent every fucking dish back. So I think the rules get you in the game. You know what's going on, you understand it. But then when you go out there and apply them, you got to be flexible enough to adjust. That's my opinion.
I love that.
It goes back to what you're saying there, Marcello. Practice, practice, practice.
Totally.
To develop a skill.
Totally.
So many authors, I think they're above it all. But what you really are, when you just boil it all down, you're a person with a great imagination and a good skill. And
Exactly.
you put that down on paper, and it's a skill like any other skill. Playing guitar well, being able to sing. And you got to practice, practice, practice.
Yeah.
And when you practice, you're
agree
learning the rules. As you practice, you learn the rules because you're learning what works and what doesn't work.
Exactly.
And
I think
those are really the rules.
You're not thinking
You're
about
honing your skills. You're honing your skills, and at the same time, you're learning the rules because you're learning what works and what doesn't work, or at least you should be.
Right. I think like writing groups and workshops are rehearsals. But then you go out there, and I think a lot of the reaction like, I'm going to break a rule, is because a lot of people some people learned the rules and didn't get the result they expected because they weren't flexible enough to understand is that after you learn the rules and you apply them, then you still have an audience. You can still perform.
Yeah. And just knowing
Shit
the rules
happens.
isn't going to make you a great writer.
Yeah, shit happens.
Shit happens,
Shit
right?
happens is right.
There you go. Shit happens. That's our summary today.
You can take that one to the bank.
Totally it.
Who's got a limerick to sign us off? Who's got a man from Nantucket? And so concludes another exciting episode of the ACME Writing Academy. This is Rick Krizman on behalf of Mike Magnuson, Jim Frank, Marcello Vazquez, and Bob Clark, thanking you for eavesdropping and inviting you to join us again at your earliest convenience. Safe travels and happy writing. Okay, that's a wrap.